What I'm going to cover off on in the next 20 minutes or so are the two projects that NGA ran last year looking at nitrogen management in wheat. And you can see from that slide, the first of those projects was our first look at some of these enhanced urea products in terms of their fit at planting. And the second project was the final year of work looking at very late applications of nitrogen in crop, really trying to focus on improving protein levels in varieties like Gregory and Suntop. First of all, with the enhanced urea products, the aim, quite simply, as it's expressed up there, it was really to see whether these new enhanced urea options, so polymer-coated ureas, for example, do they have an economic fit? Particularly from a canopy management point of view. As everyone knows, in the northwest of New South Wales, southern Queensland, we struggle with top dressing in crop in terms of the efficiency. And so one of the other alternatives is to look at these products and see if we can drip feed the crop by delaying the access to nitrogen. And the other part, of course, is to reduce those end losses. You can see some of the basic details up there in terms of the trials. They're all on EGA Gregory, which is really one of our, well, it's our most widely grown variety, but certainly a variety with quite a few issues in terms of protein generation. A number of sites, we had 5 planted. That last site, Moree, has a line through it. Came up quite nicely, but it was probably a little bit low in moisture to start with, and we ran into a very tight season just east of Moree, and that one wasn't even good enough to take through to harvest. And as you can see, lots of treatments, essentially a factorial design or embedded factorial design of a range of products. Firstly, in terms of the rates that we use, obviously we've got an untreated in there, and we've used urea, standard urea as the benchmark product. What we've essentially had, and what I'll refer to during this presentation, a half X rate, a 1X rate and a 2X rate. They were originally going to be just 50 units of nitrogen, 100 units of nitrogen or 200. But the fourth site was actually shorter plot lengths, so obviously the actual rate has increased. So what did we do? We had urea alone at all 3 of those rates, just simply surface spread and incorporated by sowing using a narrow point tine. So something that's happening quite a bit commercially. In addition to those 3 treatments, we also had that 1X rate surface spread immediately after sowing, and so all we're relying on is a rain event to get some incorporation. We're really trying to look at what sort of volatilisation losses might have been occurring from that sort of treatment. And that's one that certainly a lot of growers are interested in. And the final one here is a total 1X rate, but split between half of that put on prior to the planter. So half it's incorporated by sowing, the other half was going on surface spread at GS30. So much more what would be happening in the southern states. So that was what we did with straight urea, with what I've called the enhanced urea options. These first 2, ESN and AgriCoat, are really polymer-coated urea options where we're really trying to get that delayed release. Entrench and Entech, quite different. They're nitrification inhibitors. Much more likely, or really the only time you're likely to see a benefit is when you're getting those denitrification or nitrogen losses. So in a very wet start or in a very wet situation, that's where you might get a benefit in terms of slowing that conversion from ammonium through to nitrate and nitrite. For those products, we had that half X rate, so exactly the same amount of nitrogen as we saw with the urea alone, a 1X rate, and our third rate for each of those products, instead of going to that double rate again, we went an equivalent cost of the 1X rate of urea alone. So we've covered our bets basically with 2 rates which give you exactly the same amount of nitrogen, and the other one where it's the equivalent cost. All of those treatments were just surface spread and incorporated by sowing, exactly the same as the straight urea. First question, of course, if you're doing fertiliser response work, were the sites even N responsive? So obviously you need an untreated in there. We did NDVIs at all sites. We had significant biomass benefits, a dose response to the added nitrogen at 3 of the 4 sites. So we could probably tick the box on 3 of those sites. We didn't get that at Goondiwindi. The graph at the bottom shows the response in terms of protein in the harvested grain. So grain protein here, the black is where we haven't added any nitrogen at all, and then we've gone now half X, 1X, 2X rates. And hopefully what you can all see from that graph is we've got significant increases in protein across all 4 sites. But not surprisingly, Goondiwindi, which is this last one, is a much flatter response. That's where we didn't see the biomass response during the crop growth in August, September. We still saw a significant protein boost, but it wasn't quite as much. Okay, so from that point of view, we were thinking, great, we've got some pretty reasonable responsive sites. We've got protein responses across the board. We've got biomass in 3 of the 4 sites. That's what came through in terms of the actual yield response. At Narrabri, a bit of a textbook response in terms of applied nitrogen. This is just looking at the urea rates. The Gunnedah site looked to be just as good in mid-September, but just completely ran out of water. And you can see a dose response, but a negative dose response in that situation. And both Tummerville, which was a late planted site on the Darling Downs but irrigated, and Goondiwindi, we really didn't get any nitrogen response in terms of yield. So an interesting one there perhaps, although the untreated grain was less than 11% protein at all those sites, clearly nitrogen wasn't the main factor restricting yield. And you would have seen that in the paddock last year. Moisture was a bigger concern. Okay, so that's what we saw in terms of urea when it was applied and incorporated by sowing. This is now looking at those other 2 treatments. So we had our post-sowing pre-emergent treatment. This is really trying to get some extra data on these volatilisation losses that Graham Schwenke and others have been working on. We were fairly lucky at all 4 sites. We had between 1 and 26 mils of rain within 5 days after planting. In terms of our GS30 application, again, we didn't do too badly. We got some level of rainfall within essentially a week after application. What do we find with those treatments? The post-sowing pre-emergent gave us at least equivalent yield, protein, biomass to the same amount put on and incorporated by the sowing operation. So we weren't getting big losses under those conditions. And even where we did our split application, much more common in the south, we certainly had enough moisture in August to get a significant response to that in-crop application. Now that was the one that probably surprised me. I thought, we've had a pretty tough old spring. We're not going to get a response to that in-crop application. We certainly did, and it was giving us as good a response as putting on 100 units or the 1X rate at planting and incorporated by sowing. So whatever those timings were, we were getting good responses to straight urea. What were we seeing to those enhanced urea products? So this is looking at grain protein first, and this is the average of both the half X and the 1X rate. So you've got a little bit more power statistically. Our black columns are just straight urea, and probably what most of you will pick to start, nothing was giving us any more protein than just going with standard urea. The 3 areas where I've put a circle are where we actually had significantly lower protein in the grain. And what you can see at 2 of those sites, it was that ESN treatment, 3rd site was Agricut. So they're the ones that are meant to be giving us slow release. it looks like perhaps they've worked a little bit too well in this situation. Summary there in terms of those responses, we weren't able to find any response in terms of biomass, in terms of yield, or in terms of protein compared to urea, or a positive response compared to urea alone across any of those sites. But important point I mentioned earlier, benefits from those nitrification inhibitors are most likely in N-loss situations rather than in terms of a canopy management type benefit. What I found interesting though is that ESN significantly reduced biomass compared to urea, or compared to the same rate of urea at 2 of the 4 sites. So at that stage we were fairly happy. We've got something which was giving us a canopy management type benefit. However, as you saw in those proteins, we still had significantly lower protein compared to urea at 2 of the 4 sites. So it's worked, but in fact it's probably worked too well. Economics, fairly easy story in this case. When you've got no yield benefit, you're certainly not going to get a net benefit. All these products are going to be more expensive than urea. So there was no net benefit at 3 of the 4 sites. At Narrabri, basically half of those treatments gave us a net benefit, and it was in the order of $20 to $100 per hectare. Question, of course, is in terms of that overall nitrogen recovery, our half-X rate was the most responsive, of course. The first amount of nutrition you put on is always the most efficient. Even at our half-X rates, which was essentially 50 units of N, our grain nitrogen recovery was only about 12 to 25%. So where we've put on 50 units, we're only getting back, probably about 10 to 12 units. So the question was, where has that extra nitrogen gone? A couple of my colleagues did soil and stubble testing at 2 of the sites at Narrabri and Gunnedah, probably about 4 weeks ago now, to determine some of the fate or where those losses might have occurred. As you can see, we did soil coring down to 90 centimetres in 30 centimetre intervals, but because of the issues with all that sampling, we're only doing 4 samples per plot. So we're probably right at the margin in terms of nitrogen testing, in terms of sample numbers. And then obviously stubble testing was conducted as well. That particular slide is showing the overall nitrogen recovery to the added fertiliser that was applied. So we've got percentage recovery here. The blue is the percentage that we recovered in the grain, so protein by yield. And you can see we're getting up to probably 25% at best across those sites. The yellow was what we recovered in the soil, and then the black was actually the amount that was recovered in the stubble that was left behind at harvest, so probably a 25 centimetre, maybe 30 centimetre tall stubble. Overall at Narrabri, we could account for roughly 50 to 60% of that nitrogen. There's a fair amount that we couldn't account for. At Gunnedah, basically, we could account for the lot. I imagine that's just a sampling error because we're going with only 4 cores or 4 sites in each of those plots under high pressure, and if you hit a couple of hot spots, that throws those results right through the roof. Where was that nitrogen? No great surprise. Between 70 and 85% of it was in the top 30 centimetres. Now in hindsight, maybe we should have done 0 to 15 and 15 to 30, because I expect most of it would have been in the 0 to 15. It's just sitting there, hasn't been used. Interestingly though, when we went back and looked at the nitrogen recovery in the untreated, so that's just looking at how much soil in we had before planting, at both sites we were sitting about that 50% recovery. So what was in the soil initially, getting into the plant where we've added no extra nitrogen, we were getting that 45 to 50%. Our fertiliser that we were applying though wasn't getting us anywhere near that same sort of efficiency. Conclusions, in terms of the enhanced urea, despite all those sites being nitrogen responsive, at least to urea. We weren't getting any significant benefits from the enhanced urea options in 2014. However, as I said earlier, moisture was probably a much bigger limitation that we faced at most sites. And again, ESN worked, but in fact it worked a bit too well. And that's going to be an issue to try to get that just right. It restricted biomass, it restricted grain protein, and to me, probably the more interesting one, even in January, we were still getting significantly higher levels of ammonium in the soil tests. So someone else might have a better interpretation, but to me, we were still seeing those granules actually releasing nitrogen 6 months after they had been applied. It's still just releasing. The other project was the late nitrogen for protein work. We've presented this data in the last year or two. We've struggled to make this work from an economic point of view. We can raise protein levels, there's no doubt about that, with a foliar spray of N after head emergence, during flowering perhaps. But it's really about trying to tweak it to get the economic benefits. The last part of that project we wanted to look at was whether split applications or multiple applications of low rates help to improve that efficiency. So if we're getting 25% or 30% of that nitrogen into the grain, is it 30% each time we do it? And are we better off going with a low rate and doing it twice rather than a big rate and leaving some stranded on the leaf? Again, Gregory was the variety used. 4 different sites, all focusing on a urea solution or 2 urea solutions. 2 rates, 20 kgs or 20 units of nitrogen and 40, and you can see the 3 growth stages that we had applied the products. Last couple of slides, the single versus multiple applications. Out of all those 4 trials, we only got significant protein benefits at one site, at Malali. Here's what we saw at that particular site, so grain protein on our y-axis. Here is the protein where we didn't add any extra nitrogen late, so it's sitting around 9%. And what you can see where there was 40 units applied, in all cases we got a significant lift by about 1–1.5%. This right-hand side was looking at 3 applications of 13 units to see if that was going to be more efficient, or 2 applications of 20. And certainly at that site, it didn't really matter whether we split it in 2 ways or 3 ways, all the different timings. It was basically all down to the amount of nitrogen we had applied. And in all cases, we're getting in that order of 1 to maybe 2% extra protein, and unfortunately only changing our grade from ASW to at most APW. In terms of product or rate, a commercial urea solution, this was an experimental solution which we'd looked at the previous year and thought it might have had something better. Certainly there was no indication at that site that there was any difference. Here are the 2 rates of nitrogen being applied, and that's over both products over 3 different timings, over 4 reps, so there's a lot of data behind each point. No question you got more protein out of 40 units, but you don't get twice as much protein out of the 40 units. So the efficiency's changed. And in terms of timing, that's probably as close to a textbook response curve where our best efficiency is around the start of flowering to maybe early milk stage. Comments and economics. As I just said, that 40 unit rate gave us significantly higher protein than putting on 20. However, our recovery was about 38% on average when we put 40 units on. We nearly doubled it with the 20 unit rate. So that's what's going to help drive the economics if this ever fits in your scenarios. At that particular site, as you can see, 13 of the 14 applications or treatments gave us a significant boost in protein. That's the best result we've seen in 3 years. However, we've gone to a site which ended up having a protein level of 9.2%, going up to APW gave us no benefit from an economic point of view. So we got a significant benefit in protein, but it didn't make any difference in terms of dollars for that grain. And as a result, we've only got 4 of those 14 treatments providing any net benefit. And as you can see, it's pretty marginal at best. If I put my optimist hat on, where might you consider the approach? Looking at all the trials over the last 3 years, the biggest kick has been on those high yielding crops. That's probably no great surprise. They're growing under better conditions. There's probably a higher chance of getting high levels of recovery of that nitrogen. It's going through the plant more easily. If you're going to do it, and this is the hardest part, you'd be wanting to get a crop where it's close to a cut-off point. So just below a grade where you're going to change to DR2 or DR1 with durum, or going to go into an AH or a pH type wheat. So if you get a 1.5% kick from that, you're getting up towards that 13% protein. And obviously the third one is in seasons with a high grade or grain price spread. And as we know, that's probably only happening maybe 2 or 3 in 10. If you were to do it, the better timing it near flowering, which is a bit of a pain, and I'm sure there aren't too many growers who are too keen to be doing it at that stage. You'd go with those lower single application rates of about 15 to 20 units, which is what has happened commercially on the Liverpool Plains. However, if you are only using that sort of amount of nitrogen and you're targeting big crops, which is where we see the biggest kick, realise that your maximum protein increase is going to be capped at about 1 to 2%. And it's quite simple arithmetic. 1.75 kilos of N for every percent protein for every tonne of grain. And we can't make it work any more simply than that. So if you're expecting to get a 3%, 4% increase in protein, it just can't happen. Conclusions. Over those 3 years, there's no doubt that late foliar application of nitrogen can and generally does increase protein levels. However, over the 3 years, we've had a net benefit in 1 trial, and the best was $22 per hectare, so we're really struggling to make it actually work. And with what we've seen, we've had those treatments in a lot of the trials, application of the same amount of nitrogen earlier in the crop, much more practical and much more beneficial. Why? At that stage, you're getting a yield benefit from that nitrogen, and you generally get just as much of a protein lift from that nitrogen. Whereas if you delay it all to the very end, you really rule out getting any yield benefit. And as we all know, yield is basically king in terms of the economics. Shall we leave it there, Jack?